Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is July 18th, 2016, and we have a lot of information to catch up on. The world is in turmoil now with the events on Friday, and we haven't even been able to fully cover the other events that we wanted to talk about, but we'll try to get into that tonight because there are some important things that have already taken place that will affect international relations and the domestic situation here in the United States as well as in Europe. So we'll talk about the Nice, France attacks, we'll talk about the Turkey coup, and we'll talk about a number of other things that are relevant as well. Now, I would like to draw your attention to BrandonTurbeville.com. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, you can follow my work at activistpost.com, arrowofwisdom.org, naturalblaze.com, but certainly BrandonTurbeville.com. That's the home for all of my work, all of the videos, all of the archives, all of the relevant information there, BrandonTurbeville.com. I'd like to draw your attention to that website, specifically the article, A Real New Deal for America, 43 Points. It's sort of a brief manifesto, I guess, of demands that we want to see implemented. Now, the article was posted as a regular article, and we're trying to get that up as sort of a pinned post. It's going to be on the website where you can click it and just pull it up automatically. So it will be available in the future, but please go dig that up. There's a search box at the top left-hand corner of the website. You should plug that in. Go take a look at those 43 points, which is what we are trying to implement. Those are our economic demands, social demands, civil demands. Those demands are there. So go check them out and do what you can to agitate for their implementation. Now, Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at ucy.tv. That's where you can find the show. Highly encourage you to catch it every week. The archive version will be posted on the website on Tuesday morning. Generally speaking, Tuesday morning, sometimes Tuesday evening, depending on what time will allow. Now, we've got to jump right into the events of the week. And, of course, the event of the week started off on Friday with the Nice, France attack, which is being exploited and was reported to begin with in a very schizophrenic way. On one hand, the media is declaring that this attacker, or was declaring that the attacker was a weird loner, acting completely on his own because of his psychological problems. He had lost his wife, she left him. And then on the other hand, the media was reporting this as a terrorist attack that was aimed at the democratic institutions of France, wherever they are. If they're apparently there are democratic institutions of France, and we're waiting on reports of what those institutions are. Apparently they're democratic in some way. Maybe one day we'll find one. Can't find one right now, though. But apparently they're under attack. And that is the reports that we've been getting, right? Among these reports surrounding the attacks, we've been giving alternative media outlets many of them are suggesting that the attack was another false flag incident that was either engineered by Western intelligence agencies or facilitated by them for either purposes of propaganda, psychic driving, the establishment of this new normal of constant terror and fear, which we are now in, right? This is the new normal. We have these terrorist attacks, mass shooters, all in the public purview on a weekly basis. So which is it, right? Is this a false flag? Is it a terror attack? Or is it indeed the work of a lone nut in the midst of some kind of psychotic break? And even today, the show's being recorded on July 17th, even today, there's not enough evidence to declare it either way. We can't really say what this is. There are some interesting points that are surrounding the attack that could point to a possible false flag or government-sponsored terror attack, but the mainstream outlets, of course, are refusing to acknowledge even the possibility of a false flag attack. Not what they're saying about Turkey, but that's what they are saying about Nice. Interesting. Now, so because of that, it's incumbent upon us to mention these points and discuss them at least briefly so that all the possibilities are on the table. Now, what does this look like? What are the possibilities? Is it a terror attack? or is it a lone nut? Now, the mainstream media outlets and the law enforcement agencies are claiming that the attacker, who is 31 years old, he was Mohammed Lahouaj Boulel. That's how his name is pronounced, I believe. And they're saying that he was not known to have any direct terror connections, and this was the action of a psychologically damaged and depressed man. World leaders, however, notice this, are condemning the attack as an act of terror. They're using the attack to justify a greater erosion of what is left of civil liberties and the extension of declarations of a state of emergency, which were slated to go out, I believe, in a week in France. Now they're back on. Now, the Telegraph provides us with a description of Boulel himself, that his neighbors described him as a very weird loner. He was a father of 3. He had recently become estranged from his wife and had become depressed following the breakdown of the marriage. They interviewed a woman living in the same, which the Telegraph describes as the same shabby apartment block as Boulel, and she said that he seemed very weird. She says he lived alone. He said very little to anyone and wasn't very polite. He wouldn't hold the door open for you. I don't know how that really qualifies you for being weird in 2016, but perhaps she had some other information that wasn't published. But the Telegraph says that he had no known links with terrorism and was not under surveillance. This is in contrast to the other terror attacks that we've seen where the attackers were known to the police and were being investigated by intelligence agencies, etc., before the attacks. Now, if these accounts are to be believed, and Boulel did not commit an act of terrorism, but it was an act of random violence, that's still not stopping the French ministers and other world leaders from taking advantage of the attack to drum up support for more militarism within their own borders and for the war on terror. Now, we had the new British Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying that Britain needs to redouble its efforts to defeat brutal terrorist murderers, and the horrifying attack that after the horrifying attack in France. And she's called a meeting of senior officials in the government's emergency Cobra Committee. I'm not joking, it's called the Cobra Committee. And the United Nations is issuing a statement calling the latest, quote, cowardly and barbaric act. French Minister Manuel Valls tweeted, "The city of Nice has been hit by terrorism on the day of our national holiday. Immense pain. The country is in mourning. The French will face it." I thought he was a lone nut. I thought he wasn't a terrorist. But this is an act of terrorism, according to Manuel Valls. We had the bloated fish, President Francois Hollande, the bloated socialist fish, saying that this was a monstrosity and said soldiers were going to be deployed to support the police and security forces, particularly at the country's borders. Too bad they didn't do that when millions of immigrants were pouring in and they wanted to be politically correct and flood the country with immigrants coming from other countries that had a culture that was antithetical essentially to French society. At least they should not have been smashed together. This was the point. Tony Blair and his cabinet actually admitted that they were allowing such heavy amounts of immigration into Britain so that they could change the face and the culture of Britain forever. And they have. This was the same agenda on the march in France as well. Now, what else are we hearing about? Okay, this Boulel apparently left his ID in the truck. That's how they know who he is. He left it, well, I guess they shot him to the head of body, but he was killed. So we won't be hearing from Mr. Boulel on his side of the story or why he did it or what connections he had. We know that he left his ID in the truck. That seems to be a clever thing that happens with most of these attackers. I guess it's to say non-clever. It's not clever at all. I think apparently in the ISIS manual. They say if you're going to make a terrorist attack, a mass shooting, or a suicide bombing, make sure you leave your ID in the truck or your passport, which is apparently indestructible by fire or suicide bombing, so the investigators can tell who did it. This is not believable. This is going back to 9/11, with the paper passports survived jet fuel in the collapse of the World Trade Center towers, conveniently picked up underneath the near the wreckage. So this is something that's possibly a sign that this is indeed a false flag. Now, Boulel was known to police prior to the attacks, but they say he was not known for terrorist ties. He was known for petty crimes such as violence and using weapons. Well, I don't know if you would consider violence and using weapons petty crimes, especially not in France, where you can actually get quite the jail sentence just for having a weapon, much less using one. This guy was out on the street, and it's being reported as petty crimes. This is more strange stuff. We had terrorist drills all across France in the months leading up to this attack. This is after the prior attacks. Now we've had drills all across France. One of them, I do believe, involved using a truck as a weapon. We have to look into this a little more. All leading up to the attack in Nice. Now, it doesn't. The drills were not necessarily taking place in Nice, but they were taking place all across France. And of course, France is not the size of the United States; it's much smaller. Now, we've got to look at some of the new information that has come out here on the 17th, and we are. He had no record of making militant statements, was not known to the intelligence services. It seems he became radicalized very quickly, Cazeneuve said. Well, if he didn't have any record of making militant statements, and he wasn't known to the intelligence services, how the hell do you know he was engaged in terrorism to begin with? You don't have any evidence for that, right? You don't have any evidence that he was connected to terrorism. You don't have any statements of terrorism in any way, but yet it's terrorism. He continued, he said, "This is a new type of attack. We are now confronted with individuals that are sensitive to the message of ISIS and are committed to extremely violent acts without necessarily being trained by them." Well, how is that new? This is what we've been told, that this was going to be a possibility for years and years and years and years. This is part of the propaganda. We had earlier on Saturday a statement from ISIS's media group, Ahrar Agency. Now, I got to keep stopping to point this out. In the United States, in the Western world, this is the most advanced surveillance state technological control grid that you can imagine on the planet. It's the most advanced on that you do online and stuff that you don't do online, just because you have a phone next to you. They can read the power coming out of your toaster with the Internet of Things, if it's a smart type of appliance. But yet ISIS, the most frightening and appalling, violent terrorist group in the world, can manage to have its own newsletter, an online website, and nobody shuts it down. That's not believable. That is just not believable. But according to Ahrar, they're saying that an ISIS soldier carried out the attack in Nice. A statement was posted by ISIS supporters, and that's coming from a security force agent in France. He's saying that the person who carried out the run-over in Nice, France, is one of the Islamic State soldiers and carried out the operation in response to calls to target nationals of the coalition, which is fighting the Islamic State. Now, they didn't say that he was trained by ISIS, but they are saying that he's a soldier of ISIS. Okay, so we have other new developments in the investigation itself, though. The French authorities are now questioning 5 people on Saturday. One of them was Boulel's ex-wife. They took her into custody because, they didn't give a reason, or France. But this is what we have, right? They still are claiming. Cazeneuve says that he was radicalized very quickly, and this was a terrorist act. But he also says that there's no evidence that's been found to tie Boulel to jihadism. Well, how can he be a jihadist terrorist with no ties to jihadism? That's the big question here from French authorities. That's what they need to be asked, and that's what they need to answer. But they do say, this is sum up some more information, that a phone number that belonged to Boulel cropped up in a counterterrorism investigation into an associate of Omar Diaby, as a 41-year-old Senegalese jihadi who lived in Nice before traveling to Syria to fight the Syrians, the Syrian people, the Syrian government. Now, Diaby, he went by Omar Omsen. He has this French jihadi battalion in Syria with Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Qaeda in Syria. And the source said that the investigators made the link after cross-referencing case files after the attack in Nice. They're looking into the nature of the links between Boulel and Diaby's associate, but they're not ruling out that the two were just part of the same social circle. Now, what does all this mean? I think we can ask the question, what does this mean? Is this a false flag? Is this basically a lone nut? And I think at this point, there are many aspects of this attack that show that it could be a false flag. But also, there is the possibility here that it is indeed simply the benefits of an open immigration policy, bringing people in from all across the world and flooding your own country, and then having these types of things happen, that there are individuals having a psychotic break. At this point, we don't know. We can't call this either way. We can't call it a false flag, although there is evidence that it could be. And we can't call this a lone nut because there's evidence that it could be, but there's evidence, of course, again, that there's a false flag. Certainly, who benefits in this situation? I don't think that ISIS benefits if it is, and I don't think that that these shadowy connections that Boulel is supposed to have had would have connected, would have been the French oligarchy. And why would they have benefited if for no other reason? The NATO apparatus, sure, because this is drumming up more support for more French imperialism in the Middle East and Africa, the fight against ISIS, essentially. And it allows the French to continue a state of emergency. It allows for the continued clampdown on what is left of civil liberty in France, if there is any. All of this stuff is going to be capitalized on, and it's clear that the government is capitalizing on this issue, that the French government is capitalizing on this issue. So we definitely need to keep following this, but we cannot officially call it either way. We don't know if it's a false flag. We don't know if it is a lone wolf attack as of yet, but we will be following this over the next couple of weeks and seeing what comes out in regards to is this individual being known to intelligence services after all? Is there some other kind of connection? We'll see that over the next few weeks. Now we need to move on to overthrow Erdogan. Now, apparently Erdogan at one point asked for passage to Germany, and this is still being confirmed, but was denied. We'll get into that. We'll talk about that in a second. But there were many issues that are important that we need to talk about in relation to this, because this is really going to have a big impact on the Syrian situation. So Turkey being the center of world attention now after this military coup was launched against Erdogan, some reports early on were, of course, saying Erdogan was claiming that he had control of the government. Then the military was claiming they had control of the government. And now it appears that Erdogan does indeed have control of the government. In fact, Erdogan has gotten total control of the government and is now arresting thousands of military personnel. And we'll talk about this. Now, early on, it wasn't really clear who was behind the coup, right? The Turkish military could have been behind the coup out of a legitimate fear for the direction of the country, or it could have been Western intelligence agencies who might have been unsatisfied. Well, we'll look at that. and talk about it. I do find that it's interesting at one point that Erdogan was claiming that democracy was under threat, and he wanted the Turkish people to come out into the streets and support their government against a coup, a foreign coup. Well, if Erdogan is a man that appreciates irony, I imagine that this moment would be something that is burned into his memory. It's awfully ironic to see Erdogan calling for the people to come out and support their government against a foreign-backed coup. Isn't that ironic? Now, what we need to know in order to determine who launched this coup, we need to look at Turkish society. Now, one of the first facts that we need to mention here is what's happening right now on July 17th. And this is that the Turkish government is engaging in a purge. Turkey is now, or Erdogan is helping to arrest 6,000 people. That's after a political purge. Outside of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, I'm not sure if we've ever seen a purge of this magnitude. I'll have to go back and look, but I don't think we've seen a political purge of this magnitude in modern history. This is massive size of arrest and purging here. Now, the coup itself, in order to understand what is happening in Turkey, we need to understand a little bit about the political system, right? There's no clear answer to this question as of yet, but I think we can point a finger at something with some reasonable certainty at the end of the discussion here, because I think there's some evidence for what I'm going to say. What you need to understand is that there is a number of factions in operation in Turkey. Now, there are dozens of factions, but there's really three in the Turkish government that we need to be aware of in order to understand the complexity of the issue in the context of the coup. Now, the first faction is the Erdogan, and of course, it's Erdogan, right? Now, then there is the second faction, and that is the Turkish nationalists. These are known as the Kemalist Turks. And this faction tends to be more embedded in the deep state, which in this context means the internal structure and the backbone of the Turkish government. And for this faction, you might think of Egypt, for instance, or even in some way you might think of Gaddafi in Libya. This faction is nationalist, but it's traditionally been more open to dialogue with the world and its neighbors as opposed to acting as a spear and imperialist engines for NATO and the West. Now, then you've got the third faction, and that's being discussed more and more in the mainstream media in the West because of this coup, and that is the Gulen movement. Gulen is this wealthy businessman that has close ties to the CIA, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Fethullah Gulen, that's the individual. He's a very rich Turkish businessman who he actually runs one of the world's largest charter school and private school networks, and again been very closely linked with the CIA, and has been more or less at war with Erdogan for the last his massive narcissistic delusions of grandeur and obsession with the caliphate and so forth. It's also the fact that he does have some internal opposition, and of course we see that. So what we see are the embedded nationalists who are continually trying to rein in Erdogan's insanity, as well as his deep connection and subservience to NATO and the Western imperialists. The Gulen movement is acting as a U.S.-backed wing of potential destabilization, and that was always waiting in the lurch to act as a pressure and possibly replacement for Erdogan and the AKP if the two were to ever get too far out of line. Now, even the Turkish military is factionalized, and you need to look at that too. The military is not a homogeneous organization, especially in Turkey. There's been an issue with the U.S. and NATO have been trying to help solve for decades. And the trick is figuring out which faction is fighting which. There's obviously factions that are opposed to the Syrian war. There are factions that are supporting it. If there's an anti-war faction, we wish them well. And we wish the end of NATO in the Middle East. Accusations now are coming from Erdogan against the United States. He's saying that the United States has engineered a coup in collaboration with Fethullah Gulen. And we saw a report coming from the UK Independent. The article's called Turkey Coup, Tensions Between U.S. and Erdogan Administration Rise After Failed Power Grab. And it says, tensions between Turkey and the U.S. have escalated following the attempted coup against the Erdogan administration, with the country's leader demanding the extradition of a U.S.-based cleric accused of orchestrating the violence. Another senior official has directly blamed the United States. So, tensions rising might seem like an understatement if Turkey really believed the U.S. was behind the coup. In fact, Turkey's accusing the United States of backing an attempted assassination on Erdogan, and the bombing of the Turkish parliament building, which happened, the strafing of Turkish citizens from the air, which may or may not have happened, and the deployment of heavy armor in the streets. This is quite an accusation. This is an overt and egregious act of war on Turkey, if this is the case. But even when there's a problem in diplomacy, there's a diplomatic disagreement between countries, between Turkey and other countries, we see diplomats being expelled, diplomats being withdrawn, countries being denied use of territory for specific purposes. Turkey hasn't done any of that with the United States. They shot down a Russian jet, for God's sake, but they're not even dismissing diplomats from the United States. So in this coming week, we need to look at what will Turkey's response be. Are they going to take even the most basic, punitive, cautionary measures against the United States, or will they do nothing? Are their accusations just a distraction? And if they're a distraction, what are they a distraction from? Well, I just described the purge. Listen to how Erdogan describes this. Right? We have a Reuters article, Turkey rounds up plot suspects after thwarting coup against Erdogan. Erdogan says, they will pay a heavy price for this. This uprising is a gift from God to us because this will be a reason to cleanse our army. Political opponent who's lodged in the United States. This raises serious suspicions over who might be behind the coup. Now, it did appear to be, if it was sort of a false flag by Erdogan, it was a convincing one, but it ultimately failed, and it provided him with the perfect context to uproot the nationalists, the military deep state. His political allies and the U.S. policymakers have sought to eradicate the nationalists for decades, and now Erdogan is doing it. Now, there is the apparent rift between the United States and Turkey, but it should be noticed that for the last 5 years, especially, Erdogan and his government have played a key role in the regime change operations in Syria. So it was Erdogan's, I guess what we should say, Islamist factions that, including factions with Turkish intelligence and within the military itself, that trained, armed, equipped, funded, facilitated these terrorists from Turkey to go into the Syrian, go across the Turkish-Syrian border and go into Syria. Without Erdogan's support in that Turkish-Syrian border where these terrorists come in, so that you have to remember that as well. Now, what is the litmus test in regards to Turkey and the Turkish coup? If the world is expected to believe the accusations by Turkey regarding the U.S. involvement in the coup, then we have to see significant changes in the foreign policy. We will either see it or we won't, and that will tell us who is behind this, right? What would be a rational response from Turkey? It would be the expulsion of U.S. diplomats. It would be the expulsion of U.S. forces from Turkish territory, including Incirlik Air Base, as well as from Turkey's border with Syria. The expulsion, again, of the diplomats and the closure of America's substantially large embassy and diplomatic complex in Ankara would be expected in this type of situation. In fact, Turkey would be reevaluating its membership within NATO, because that's an alliance. Keep in mind, if the United States was guilty of this, NATO did not come to Turkey's aid. This was a military attack upon the Turkish government by one of NATO's own members being made against the U.S. Turkey would be expected to realign itself geopolitically, and that would mean closer ties to Europe, not the United States, to Russia and Iran, and among others, possibly even China. Turkey would have to end its role in the destruction of Syria, especially if they want to deal closely with Russia and Iran. We need to look for these changes. Now, we don't want to see international relations debilitate to the point where countries don't talk to one another, but we would like to see Turkey stop its war against Syria and start acting as a more rational participant in world discourse. Will we see these things happen in the next week or 2 weeks? That would tell us. If we see those things happen, then we can look at the United States and we can say that was engineered from the West, most likely. If it does not happen, we will look at the Turkish government as having staged a coup on itself, a false flag type coup. Now, is there the possibility that it wins, especially with such a close ally? We will see in the next week or two who is responsible for this coup because of the way that Turkey reacts and responds to the situation. I will hazard a guess that none of those changes are going to take place. And that's going to indicate to us that the entire event was staged, not against Turkey, but by Turkey, with the help of the United States, with the help of Gulen's political faction, with the help of NATO. It's essentially what Tony Carlucci refers to as the 21st century Reichstag fire, leading to a 21st century Hitlerian purge. And I think that's probably a good description of the situation. So we're going to have to wait and see on this one as well, but I think the evidence is pointing towards the United States and Erdogan himself working together to create the situation in which the nationalists can be purged. If that's the case, then God help Turkey, because that is not a positive development in any way. We would like to see the nationalist elements actually do much better in terms of their control over. We're talking about building the infrastructure of the country and interacting with their neighbors in a way that does not involve imperialism and the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. It's essentially Turkey first, but in terms of economics, in terms of infrastructure, and that's the kind of things that we want to see in terms of development and all of that. So we're going to keep watching that over the next week, and you can bet that we will be reporting on it on the next show next week. Now, in keeping with our discussion of foreign affairs, I want to mention John Kerry. Horse-faced John Kerry has made a bit of a gaffe in his recent performance, and we'll get to that. But we had, speaking of abysmal sets of public relations performances, we had State Department spokesman Mark Toner over the last few months trying to explain the nature of the opposition in Syria and the difference between the moderate terrorists and the extremist terrorists, and the answer was simply that Toner gave an incoherent, dawdling answer. He kept going back and forth and couldn't actually answer the question, but the reason for that is that he was given an impossible task to begin with. Even under the smallest amount of criticism and questioning, his State Department line was destined to fall apart. And The idea that Ahrar Al Sham and Jaish al-Islam were somehow moderate in any way or separate from ISIS and Nusra is and always has been a complete farce. So Toner's display was the result of trying to promote a lie that's easily disproven. And in the State Department's defense, though, we should say that convincing Americans of an easily disproven lie has been a relatively easy task throughout the past few decades. But this time, the alternative press has let the cat out of the bag, and even a relatively small conglomeration of unrelated alt-news organizations and other independent media outlets have essentially dismantled a patently absurd falsehood that's been promoted by the U.S. government. Now, maybe not in the general public, but among people who are paying attention, the alternative media has helped dismantle a lot of this narrative that's been peddled by the State Department in regards to Syria. But this lie that they have has been hanging by a thread because of that, and it was hanging by a thread when Toner was sweating bullets and dancing around like a little frightened clown. But Skull and Bones Horseface Kerry has officially snapped the thread. So his constant assertion that Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham are completely different from Nusra and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, even if there is some harmless commingling, according to Kerry, he's now admitted that these groups are one and the same. In a conversation with Walter Isaacson, which was held in front of an audience on June 28, 2016 at the Aspen Ideas Festival in Colorado, it was ironically recorded by the U.S. State Department, Kerry demolished the entire basis for support and protection of these moderate elements in the opposition in Syria. This is what Kerry said. This is Kerry's quotes. "Everybody knows the threat. We've all awakened to the news that I just announced to you. How many times have you awakened to it? Vicious attacks perpetrated by a lone wolf or by a group inspired on the internet or otherwise. From Orlando to San Bernardino to the Philippines and Bali, we've seen the pictures and we've heard testimony of shocking crimes committed by Al-Qaeda, by Boko Haram, by Jaish al-Islam, by Ahrar Al Sham, by Al-Shabaab, Daesh, other groups against innocent civilians, against journalists, against teachers particularly. But the most important thing, frankly, is seeing if we can reach an understanding with the Russians about how to, number one, deal with Daesh and Al-Nusra. Al-Nusra is the other group there, Jabhat al-Nusra. They are a designated terrorist group by the United Nations, and there are a couple of subgroups underneath the two designated, Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham particularly, who brush off and fight with that, alongside these other two, sometimes to fight the Assad regime." End quote. So the first thing is that Kerry is admitting that his moderate rebels are indeed guilty of heinous atrocities. At the very least, he puts them in the same category as Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and Shabaab and ISIS. But he admits that these atrocities were aimed at civilians and journalists and teachers, non-combatants, essentially. But secondly, Kerry is openly admitting that Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham are nothing more than subgroups of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Not only does he admit that the groups fight together, but that they are inextricably linked. These statements, now they're true, but they stand entirely in opposition to the Western narrative that's been propagated throughout the mainstream media in the halls of Western governments over the last 5 years. So what's the big difference between the moderate terrorists and the extremist terrorists that are running rampant in Syria? At one time, we were told that there were no terrorists at all. Then we were told there were terrorists present, but that they were also moderate, secular, democracy-loving freedom fighters in the country. And now, after the nature of these so-called rebels have been revealed ad infinitum by the alternative and independent press, it's admitted that the fighters in Syria are terrorists, but apparently some are moderate, some are extreme. Now, they all have the same goal of Sharia. They all hate minorities. They all hate Christians, Alawites, and Shiites. They all torture. They all rape. We could go on and on. In the world of the West's rebels, there's not one shred of difference between any of the armed groups fighting against the secular Syrian government besides the names they call themselves. But we're still told that there are clear differences and that the U.S. State Department knows just what they are. But they don't tell the American people, or the Russians, or the Syrians, or anybody. the moderate terrorists are this very mysterious force, a group that might be spoken of, but one that never really shows itself. So, of course, there are groups that the U.S. admits are brutal killers, but somehow rationalizes to the public that they're our brutal killers. And the U.S. can, at times, be forced to admit that the groups it supports as freedom fighters have committed atrocities and rapes and murders and torture people and establishment of Islamic theocracy upon the unwilling inhabitants. But the U.S. can admit, when pressured, only that these groups have the same ideology as ISIS, and they don't want to go any further than that. And even then, they won't say those exact words. So it's clear that any designation of terrorist groups as extremists or moderates is obviously based on political motivation and geopolitical designs, not the nature or action of the terrorist group in question. If that were the case, then Ahrar Al Sham and Jaish al-Islam and other groups would easily be listed as terrorist organizations that would subsequently not be covered under the ceasefire agreement. There is no distinguishing characteristic that sets these groups apart from ISIS or Nusra, just the name. So when the Russians attempted to remove these groups from the list of non-protected terrorists in Syria, which protected at the insistence of the West, the United States, Britain, France, and Ukraine rushed to their rescue and blocked the Russian proposal. This is despite the fact that both of these groups, which make up around half of the Syrian opposition forces thanks to Western name changes, have repeatedly worked with Nusra and ISIS forces. Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham have both worked so closely with ISIS and Nusra that the groups themselves are virtually interchangeable. But the U.S. is only digging its own international public relations grave now with the refusal to designate known and obvious terrorists as precisely what they are, particularly when it's launched campaigns of destruction and death across the world on the basis of allegedly fighting terror. So the Russians have forced Western nations to admit, despite their rhetoric, terrorist organizations are doing their bidding and have never truly been targets of NATO forces. The Western public remains totally befuddled as to the nature of the crisis in Syria. I mean, unfortunately, many don't even know there is a Syrian crisis, but Western propaganda has created such a complex and distorted view of the situation that any newcomer or casual observer is going to find it incredibly difficult to navigate through the lines of deceit. So for the rest of the world, much of that propaganda is ridiculous and transparent, but for that reason, as well as many others, the U.S. and NATO are losing more and more credibility by the day. So we have Kerry admitting that Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham are terrorists equal to ISIS and Nusra, but refusing to bomb or to allow anyone else to bomb them. Now, what about Ahrar Al Sham? I would refer any researcher who wants to learn more about Ahrar Al Sham specifically to go visit Vanessa Billy's website, thewallwillfall.org, and her article, Syria, John Kerry Torpedoes U.S. Ahrar Al Sham Moderate Rebel Status. Beeley is an excellent Syria researcher. She's produced incredibly informative articles. She's repeatedly embarrassed the reported death squad organizer, former U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford. And she's written extensively on the nature of these various groups who are operating on the ground in Syria, including Ahrar Al Sham. So I refer people to her. But just looking at Ahrar Al Sham as a standalone moderate group, they've been responsible for some of the most hideous ethnic cleansing of Syria's minorities. It's merciless and brutal, and they've terrorized the Shiite villages of Kafarya and Fua. They placed them under partial siege since 2011 and full siege since March of 2015. Over 1,700 civilians, women and children included, were massacred by these free men of the Levant. And both cities, Kafarya and Fua, continue to deal with the shelling and sniping of Ahrar Al Sham. Beeley says that she was told by a resident of Al Fua that Ahrar Al Sham don't even behave like Muslims. Right? The bodies of their own dead are put on display so they can drive fear into the hearts of villagers that are already starving and imprisoned under their silly religious dictatorship. The United Nations, of course, has failed to deliver humanitarian aid to Kafarya and Fua on numerous occasions they were deterred by the threat of Ahrar Al Sham checkpoints that are considered too serious a security risk. So those are your moderates. In May 2016, Ahrar Al Sham massacred scores of Alawite villages and villagers in Al Zahra. They kidnapped other people. They claims that they didn't hurt anybody who didn't resist were cited by Reuters and other Western media outlets, but the witnesses and the survivors of the whole situation told a much different story. One photo that circulated after that murder showed that Ahrar Al Sham fighters were standing over the dismembered and bloodied corpses of a number of women. Now, the terrorist group didn't make any effort to deny those images. They just stated that those women had taken up arms and they were legitimate victims of their own decisions, and that was a claim that was endorsed by Western media that stood by their moderate killers. We had Ahmad Muhammad Al-Qasim saying, "Strangers came to our village. Most of them were foreigners. We understood that they weren't from Syria from the way they looked. They attacked our village. Many were killed. My brother is among the dead. His children were wounded. They killed entire families." We also have another villager, Munzer Qasim. He said, "They perpetrated a massacre. I heard 2 or 3 entire families killed. Abu Naval's family was killed. He was an old man and was killed together with his daughters. They were slaughtered in their own house." And that was a report that was published in Syria Free Press. Ahrar Al Sham was also implicated in the mass suicide bombing on May 2016 that claimed the lives of over 100 civilians, severely injured many more in Jobla and Tartus. And both of those towns were numbers of internally displaced Syrian refugees were taking refuge there. The Western and Gulf media was quick to claim that ISIS was responsible, but local residents in those areas, which we reported about here on this radio show and in my articles, described that it was Ahrar Al Sham, and they had already taken responsibility on Syrian TV. The Western protection of these assets again was demonstrated by trying to protect these terrorist groups from being blamed for the mass murder of civilians who were operating under the Ahrar Al Sham umbrella. I mean, the terrorist groups were Ahrar Al Sham, not civilians. But Ahrar has been complicit in a multitude of crimes against humanity. We could go for hours talking about their crimes, but I think the point has been made. Now, the Western media, which has now rushed in to protect John Kerry and try to make it look like it was just all a mistake and an accident that he named Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar Al Sham as subgroups of Nusra and ISIS. But the fact is there has never been any difference between these organizations, and the reality is that this has been exposed time and time again in growing numbers of outlets in the alternative and independent media. There never were, there are not any moderates operating in Syria. The West has intentionally armed and funded Al-Qaeda and other sectarian extremists since as early as 2007, some even say 2005, in preparation for this destabilization for the benefit of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and NATO. This is just... remember, Ben Hubbard wrote for the New York Times, "Nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of." So, with all that now taken together, now that Kerry has admitted his lie in front of the world, what is to be done? Are we to continue with the same policy of arming proxy terrorists to overthrow a democratically elected president in the name of democracy? Now, the ruling class is no doubt going to soldier on, despite having outed themselves by the elongated mouth of John Kerry. But we have other solutions, right? The American people, which needs to be facilitated by the alternative and independent media. We need to begin to not only resist the machinations of the oligarchy here that's promoting war, but we need to be able to make some demands of our own. So first, we want to demand an immediate cessation of hostilities with Syria. all funds, all arms, all intelligence, all training, all assistance, period, that is being provided to proxy terrorists or any other opposition groups in Syria must be stopped, and a normalization of relationships with the Syrian government must be established. We want assistance to be provided to the Syrian government in the form of satellite intelligence, on-the-ground intelligence, where it might be, in order to facilitate the mopping up of terrorists on Syrian soil. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, they need to be pressured. This is part of our demand. They need to be pressured to do likewise, and Israel and Turkey need to be pressured to close their borders with Syria. We need a subsequent plan of investment in the rebuilding and modernization of Syrian infrastructure. We need that to be launched by the Western nations using the credit of a nationalized Federal Reserve, or requisite seized part of the national bank, or national bank that's created, and we can use that credit to be adapted to provide credit for the Syrian government, and where if there's question of corruption, then we will provide material for rebuilding and modernizing and developing Syrian infrastructure that could be produced here. That's more jobs. And we can avoid corruption that way and a misallocation of funds. The unjust and immoral war on Syria has gone on long enough, and every narrative peddled by the United States, the West, NATO, the GCC, and Israel, all of that has been systematically dismantled. Syrians and Americans are in no need of any new narratives. We are in need of peace. We are in need of stability. We want human rights. And we are in need of living standards that are worthy of the 21st century. That's what we want. That's what we are demanding. Now, I want to end this broadcast with a bit of good news that's taking place across the world. Okay, we want to mention that as Monsanto and Big Ag are taking a beating around the world, except for the United States, of course, where they're actually growing more powerful, Russia has dealt a blow to these big ag corporations. The Russian State Duma passed a bill banning both the import and production of genetically modified foods. So while the United States is moving forward with the Dark Act, Russia is moving in the opposite direction. So ensuring that the entire country is GMO free, the Russian bill allows all crops and animals, it applies to all crops and animals that are genetically modified except for a small number of the crops and animals being researched and studied for scientific purposes. The Deputy Prime Minister Arkady Dvorkovich announced the intention to ban GMOs in 2015, but there were no legal penalties for producing them. There are now legal penalties. So for the production or importation of GMOs is going to carry a fine of 10,000 to 50,000 rubles for individuals and 100,000 to 500,000 rubles for violations committed by legal entities. The Russian officials now are insisting that domestic farms are more than able to produce enough food for the entire country, and they've expressed hopes of stopping all those imports of meat, dairy, or vegetables, period, by 2020. So we want to applaud the Russian government for implementing a reasonable solution to a problem that's plagued people all across the world, the Western world, the Third World. We want to encourage the rest of the world to move in this direction. So that's a small victory. Ladies and gentlemen, we're running out of time, but I want to encourage you. You do need to go to BrandonTurbeville.com and read the article, A New Deal for America, a real New Deal for America, 43 points. Those are your list of demands. We'll be augmenting and adding to and clarifying in the future. But those are your list of demands. That is your marching orders for getting active. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.TV.